Welcome to this Carnegie meeting on the provocative topic, Does the West Still Exist? I'm Stuart Patrick, Senior Fellow and Director of the Global Order and Institutions Program here at the Carnegie Endowment. My idea in organizing this event was to assess the cohesion and solidarity of the community of advanced market democracies that has constituted the core of the US-led liberal international order since the 1940s, both during and then after the Cold War. It's become commonplace, as you know, to speak in recent years about living in a post-Western world. But the past several months suggest that this might be true in more ways than one. When most people use the expression post-Western, they're highlighting the rise of the so-called rest, that is the emergence of an array of non-Western global and regional powers, most notably China, of course, but also encompassing India, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and many others. But alongside the rise of the rest, the question that is before us is whether or not we're seeing, at least in some regards, the demise of the West as a coherent and meaningful geopolitical entity. Are we witnessing the disintegration of this tight-knit club of like-minded countries that has been the anchor of an open, rule-based international system since 1945? And if so, do we need a new organizing concept or framework for thinking about world order and the foundations of international cooperation? So some big picture questions. And the motivation for this conversation is, of course, the Trump revolution in American foreign policy. The president, of course, has adopted an avowedly America first foreign national security and international economic policy. It is hyper-nationalist, it's unilateral, it's sovereigntist, and it's transactional in its ethos. In contrast to his predecessors, the president rarely speaks about U.S. global leadership and responsibility. He doesn't say a lot about democracy, human rights, and development. And he often expresses disdain for alliances, multilateralism, and international law. And finally, he's skeptical about America's historic role in helping contribute to global public goods, from open trade to international UN peacekeeping. So these abrupt shifts have sent shockwaves through America's traditional democratic partners, including, of course, in Europe, in Canada, and in the Asia Pacific. And in April, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, bluntly declared the West as we know it no longer exists. Now, the other possibility is that we should stop clutching our pearls and things aren't nearly so dire, right? That we should all take a deep breath and recognize that the West continues to exist as a coherent entity. Given recent events, including the just finished NATO summit, the previous G7 summit in Kananaskis, Canada, ongoing U.S. EU disputes over tariffs, and of course the unilateral U.S. bombing of nuclear sites in Iran, it seemed like it was an opportune moment to take a step back and consider the health, the coherence, and the heft of the West as we've known it. Fortunately, we have three wonderful experts who are extremely well placed to address this topic. Sofiya is a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, where she focuses on European defense policy and transatlantic relations. Rosa Balfour is a senior fellow and director of the Carnegie Europe Center, which is our outpost in Brussels. And finally, Kori Schake is a senior fellow and director of the Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, right next door to us here in Washington. She is also the author of an excellent and relevant new foreign affairs piece, Dispensable Nation, America in a Post-American World. So I'm really looking forward to being able to engage all of you in conversation. So welcome. I want to begin by asking each of you to reflect broadly on the state of relations amongst Western countries in the context of the Trump revolution. And I'd like to start with Sofiya and then move to Rosa and then to Kori. So Sofiya, can you tell us a little bit about, in your mind, how big of a shock has Trump 2.0 been to Europe? You know, as we know, historically, relations between the U.S. and its partners have ebbed and flowed, whether in crises like Nixon closing the gold window, the Euro missile crisis, or the Iraq war. What's your assessment about the health and solidity of the West as you interpret that concept?
Yes, thank you so much, Stuart. Thank you for convening us all. I suspect we're all part of many NATO summit and G7 summit debriefs. And so it's a real joy to be able to think a bit more ambitiously about the broader context here. And it's such a pleasure to be on the same panel as Kori and Rosa. So thank you. Right. So how much of a shock has it been? what is my assessment of the West? Pretty big question to start with. I'll try to discipline myself and be fairly brief. I think that Trump's return to the White House has been less a surprise than a confirmation of sort of Western allies' worst fears. His first term has obviously already eroded trust in U.S. reliability. And I do think that many European leaders did hope that 2020 would mark a course correction. But I do think that we have moved past the shock. The fact that President Trump is back and unapologetically so has, I think, engendered a pretty profound psychological and strategic paradigm shift in many of America's closest Western partners. And what we're seeing is that this time it's not just about unpredictability or rhetorical attacks on NATO. It's about the structural recognition that the United States may no longer be a consistent anchor of the Western alliance system. Trump 2.0 has doubled down on America first, on rejecting multilateralism, questioning defense commitments, openly sympathizing with leaders like Vladimir Putin. And we've seen really interesting illustrations, I think, with the G7 and the NATO summit of how leaders are trying to deal with this. They've both tried to manage the current moments, I think, in very different ways. Neither, to my mind, has signaled real strength of the West. I think the G7 aimed for normalcy and failed. We've had no joint communique. We've had little coherence, a clear sense that the action was elsewhere, very explicitly for President Trump. He wanted to solve policy problems and he left the meeting to do that. And then the NATO summit went very minimalist with just a 2.5 hours meeting, carefully choreographed to avoid friction and hand President Trump a win. But we had no new Russia strategy. We had barely a word on Ukraine. I think both summits in their own way revealed a West that is more focused on managing internal tension than projecting unity or purpose. I want to just 2 quick points. One, and you've alluded to this in your opening remarks, Stuart, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but I do think to really assess the health of the West, we have to look beyond transatlantic politics under President Trump. There is a real crisis of global legitimacy of this concept, with powers like India, Brazil, Indonesia, African states calling out double standards, rejecting the notion that the West has a monopoly on universal norms. And I think the uncomfortable truth is that much of the global South sees no contradiction between President Trump's America and the Western order. It sees continuity, right? A West that preaches democracy while cutting deals with autocrats, that invokes rules by breaking them when convenient. So in that sense, President Trump maybe doesn't so much undermine the West's normative credibility as he reveals its fragility. He's not the exception, he's the mask slipping. I think that's how many countries around the world would see it. And this is not just about the United States, by the way. I mean, the lackluster European response to first Israel's actions in Gaza and then the Israeli and American strikes against Iran, the sense that there's no real European ambition to uphold an order that the US has tapped out of, most starkly put by Germany's Chancellor Merz when he thanked Israel for doing Europe's dirty work. All that, I think, is seen and registered by a broader world. And that broader context matters because it means that the West isn't just divided, it's isolated, right? It's fragmented within and no longer capable of projecting a coherent, appealing model outward. And this goes to my third and final point. I think we at least need to consider the possibility that a new kind of transatlantic alignment is emerging, not the old liberal one, but an illiberal one, with the MAGA movement in the US finding ideological allies in far-right parties across Europe that share a worldview rooted not in democracy or human rights, but in nationalism, anti-globalism, cultural grievance, resentment, really. I don't know what we want to call this, if it's the new West or the revisionist West or the pseudo-West or the Wild West. I'm throwing out different ideas, but in that sense, the West still exists. But I think in terms of political purpose, moral coherence, global influence, it's not just weakened, it's contested, both from without and from within.
Extremely useful. Thank you so much, Sofiya. Great observations. The issue of whether or not Donald Trump is simply saying the quiet part out loud, that in terms of the mask slipping from the perspective of a lot of other countries, is, I've certainly heard that quite a bit. And then this notion also that there may be an internal debate over, in addition to the divisions within, between Western countries and notably transatlantic divisions, there also are increasing debates over what the West should stand for to the degree that it exists. And we can pick up on some of these points. Rosa, can I turn to you now? When you think historically, And you've attended a number of different summits, obviously, and have been an observer of transatlantic relations for so long. Do you feel like there's something qualitatively different about this current moment in terms of maybe an inflection point along the lines that Sofiya was discussing? I'd be really interested in areas where solidarity is most tested. And as trust has been declining, have you seen important shifts or even hedging by Western partners? I realize I put a lot on the table, but I'd love your perspectives on how you see this moment with respect to the West.
So let me just start. I really agree with the way in which Sofiya framed this about, the shock and awe at what's happening, but also the sort of structural shifts and the degree to which Europeans have become cognizant that, this time it is different. And in this sense, I'm kind of trying to answer your question in the sense that it goes deeper, it's more structural, and it's likely to shape, Trump's decisions are likely to shape some kind of new world order. We don't actually know what that order or disorder is going to look like. At the moment, there's more disorder than not, but there's something paradoxical. And, I've just come back from the NATO summit, and there is something paradoxical about all these summits that have taken place. On the one hand, it looks to us that the decisions of the United States are basically the twilight of US hegemony, and that we're going to be moving into a different world order in which other powers are going to be much more influential. And looking at things from Brussels, the big question is, where does Europe want to fit in this? And in which areas does it want to try and seek a niche or some leadership, etc.? But on the other hand, we've also seen this extraordinary spectacle of, European leaders and NATO allies coming together to make sure that they bring the goodies for, monarch Trump, or Daddy Trump, as Secretary General of NATO put it. So to make sure that the US remains committed to NATO, remains committed to its alliances. So all the sort of performative politics that are taking place around the US president are very much about trying to reassure themselves and the world that the West is still there. So it's actually quite a paradoxical moment because on the one hand, if you look at structural trends, this looks like the US abandoning its security, its global security role. It looks like the US abandoning its traditional allies. It looks like the US is very much tempted by isolationism, and we're all reading about, the groups within the Republican Party that are influencing the president. But on the other hand, everything that all the other leaders are doing is try to maintain that and try to perform in such a way that the US does not lead. So I feel that we're in a somewhat paradoxical moment. And from looking at it from Brussels and from a European perspective, it's not entirely clear where Europe actually intends to go in this sort of shifting space.
Marty, can I just come back to you on that? There's always been a debate. I don't have to tell someone from Brussels about, Europe as an integrated Europe as a coherent, cohesive entity, and a Gaullist version of a Europe des patries, Europe of the nation states. And do you, how do you think about that in terms? I mean, obviously there are many divisions and tensions within the 27 members of the bloc, but I'm interested in how you conceive of Europe as whether it's taking sort of more of a unified position, or is this really sort of vanguard nation states and the big powers who will ultimately determine which direction this goes in?
Yeah, no, you're quite right. The European Union and the way in which politics in this continent have functioned has always been very divisive, so it's quite hard sometimes to see the sense of direction. There's different readings of this. One is, and I would say these different readings slightly reflect the sort of three big groups that, and the one that will dominate or will be most persuasive will probably shape where Europe goes. And the first group is, this is a moment that Europeans need to seize. We need to work on building our security and defense capabilities. We need to work on rejuvenating and upscaling the economy so that we can continue to be a relevant and influential economic actor. And this is the moment to do this. And there is a group, we've seen that, for instance, a coalition of the willing coming together after the meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky in the White House in February. We've seen that that there was a lot of political energy and momentum around this. This coalition of the willing could also be, and it includes EU members, but also non-EU members. This could be the driving force between towards building up security and defense capabilities, trying to face the Russian threat, and this could be led by this group of countries. So in other areas, you might have another coalition of the willing that is formed to look, for instance, at how the moment can be seized for investments in security and defense to also re-energize the economy, to bring some new funding into innovation and technology. And there you might see other types of coalitions of the willing moving forward. So that is the likely picture that I see in the future. But there are two more groups in Europe that are also politically influential. The first is the pro-Trumpians, and Sofiya was also alluding to them, that there are several political actors in Europe who actually say, well, this is what we've been arguing for 3 decades. Some of these political actors have actually been influential in the United States. I'm thinking of Viktor Orban and everything he's done to cultivate the Trump base and to inspire the Trump base with several ideas. So these actors are actively working against a greater European integration. They're actively working against European projects that would bring European states closer together. And then, of course, there's another group, and that is the transatlanticists, the traditional transatlanticists. And these could be, at the moment, they have been perhaps the most shocked by what has been happening in Washington, but they are also perhaps the most attached to the transatlantic relationship. So in 3 years' time, they might be the transatlantic nostalgics who will want to, or will push towards a return to the status quo ante, should there be a change of government in the United States. So, I think this is a moment certainly of opportunity, but you have these different groups and different opinions in Europe, and it's not always clear which one is going to prevail.
Superb. Thank you so much, Rosa, for that. Corey, in addition to feeling free to comment on anything that we've put on the table so far, I did want to just touch on a couple of issues. The first one picks up on this question of, in a sense, political culture. And much has been made, and certainly was at the Munich Security Conference with Vice President Vance's sort of dramatic speech on, in a sense, a growing difference between political culture in the US on the one side and Europe on the other, and the question of whether or not there was a major ideological schism there. But as Rosa has just pointed out, of course, in some ways, this may be a reflection of broader divisions affecting all Western countries, including whether the definition of the West is fundamentally one about political principles or sort of civilizational construct. But more generally, I'm very interested in what you think about the staying power of America First, a definitive aspect of post-war U.S. global leadership, as you write in Foreign Affairs, and I've done a little writing on this as well, is the sort of cooperative, relatively consensual approach to hegemony, having partners, etc. But viewed in historical perspective, Trump seems like a throwback to a 1941 mindset. I mean, even a Jacksonian mindset, which makes one wonder whether or not there's any going back after he leaves. So if you have any comments on that, as well as just how you interpret the current moment, I'd be very interested. Thank you.
Sure. Well, it is easy to despair about the amount of support among Republicans that the president and vice president's approach to a lot of these issues has. But as somebody involved in the daily argument among Republicans about this, I do not despair, actually, because I think what we are living through is a real-time test of whether these approaches actually solve people's problems. And what I noticed in the first Trump term was that when President Trump got elected in 2016, Americans broadly agreed with him that allies were not doing nearly enough for themselves, that trade was exporting American jobs, and that immigrants were taking American jobs. Now, granted, I mean, immigrants don't take American jobs, they create American jobs, and they fill jobs Americans don't want to do. So I'm not speaking to the legitimacy of the points, but they were broadly supported by the American public in 2016. 2 years later, you saw a greater than 15 percentage point drop in support for those approaches, because once they saw the policies President Trump put into place, they were unhappy with the policies. And I think we are already experiencing a similar phenomenon, which is, I mean, President Trump, other than the deployment of military forces to Los Angeles, President Trump has not utilized any authorities that were not available to President Biden to address Americans' concern about immigration. And it looks to me like President Biden might have done a lot better. Democrats might have done a lot better in 2024, if they had exercised those authorities and addressed public concern about illegal immigration. But I also think that what you're seeing is a broad public reaction among Americans that they don't like the policy the president's putting into place. And so I think that traditional conservatism actually has better answers to these problems. And we're having a real-time test of what the public thinks of the president's solutions. And I'm pretty confident that traditional conservative approaches are going to look really good the more experience Americans have with President Trump's approach, not just on immigration, but on treatment of America's friends in the world. As you nicely pointed out, Stuart, both you and I have long argued that American power floats on the voluntary cooperation of so many countries in the international order and cannot be sustained without that voluntary cooperation.
Thank you so much, Corey, and we'll jump back to that, I know, as we get into this next topic, which is really turning to talk about NATO a bit. We're obviously meeting on the heels of the Hague Summit, as well as the aftermath of last week's bombing of Iranian nuclear sites, which short-circuited EU negotiations with the Iranians. I'm not entirely sure of when European allies were alerted to the fact that those strikes were going to occur. But let me turn first to Rosa, if I might, on this. You attended this summit, which, in some ways, it turned out to be on the surface a little bit more of a love fest than anticipated. But I think that's partly because, as you said, there was a lot of genuflection in the direction of the president and trying to have some significant damage control. So I'd like your assessment of what transpired and what it tells us about the health of NATO. There was an op-ed a few days before the summit itself by Michael O'Hanlon, who is also next door, but on the other side at the Brookings Institution, and in the New York Times, where he said, look, NATO's doing just fine, thank you, given progress on the perennial burden sharing debates. They've always been with us. And certainly, Mark Rutte attempted to suggest optimism and that the United States is 100% committed to NATO, et cetera. I guess the question is, do you share this optimism on progress on joint priorities? And then if you have any comments on the additional comments on the U.S. use of force against Iran and how that was received by members of the alliance, that would be great.
So, the goal was to dodge the bullet. The goal was to keep the US engaged in NATO to avoid any question of Article 5. And before the summit, Trump had done that. So all the NATO leaders who came out of the summit, that's what they were underlining. You know, we have accomplished this, and we've done so by agreeing to this 3.5% of GDP to be spent on defense and 1.5 on infrastructure. So the total comes out 5.5% on spending on security and defense. I guess, and that was it. That was the goal for the summit. So it was a very narrow goal, which actually doesn't say very much about how to address the Russia threat, which is the main preoccupation of European leaders. And it doesn't say very much about how to spend that investment on defense. The only thing it does say is that this goal will be revised in 2029, which is after Donald Trump's term will be over. So I guess if that was the goal, then I guess one can say, you know, mission accomplished. What I would be interested in seeing, and I guess this is what will be beginning now, is precisely how are European states going to coordinate so that their security and defense capabilities are actually fit for purpose with respect to the current threat landscape, which, you know, for Europe, from the point of view of Europe, really stems from Russia's, you know, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but also all the other sort of grey zone activities and hybrid and cyber attacks in Europe. How that is going to be translated into better coordination, better defense integration in Europe, be it, you know, as the sort of European pillar of NATO, and there's not that much indication of that. Today, EU leaders are also meeting in another summit. The summit conclusions might offer a few, you know, indications of how they intend to go, both on that front and also on the Middle East. But at the moment, it really is rather, I don't want to say paper thin, but it's a bit devoid of substance at the moment. There've been a lot of discussions and debates, but actually how to go about it, I think we're still, you know, we're still left guessing a little bit. The other point that I'd like to highlight, and I mean, I'm assuming that European leaders were quite content that Secretary General Rutte took on the role of, you know, appeasing Trump and therefore avoiding some embarrassing moments for other European leaders that might have felt less inclined to use certain kinds of expressions that Rutte made. But he also said, you know, we're fully behind the US and, you know, bombing Iran, et cetera, Well, that is problematic, I think, for European leaders and for European publics, in the sense that the European leaders always claim to be, you know, upholding international law, and a lot of the rhetoric and posturing of European leaders is very much around, you know, we are standing by international law. That is the grounds. Those are the grounds around which Europeans have tried to persuade the rest of the world of the need to support Ukraine, because Russia has broken territorial integrity of another country. And, you know, I think there's a little bit of a risk that by trying to keep the Americans in, international law gets kicked out of the window. So I think that is a bit of a risk there. And then the final point that I think needs to be raised is the question of public opinion. Clearly at this NATO summit, there have been big efforts in trying to persuade domestic audiences of the need to make these big investments. Obviously, if you're going to move from, you know, less than 2%, because some countries, and we know that Spain decided not to endorse the 5% goal, some countries are actually spending below 2%. A plurality have reached the 2% target that was set over 10 years ago, but not all of them have got there. If you're going to move from, you know, below 2% to 5%, in such a short space of time is going to be very hard to find the financial resources. And Sofiya can speak more to this. You know, Germany has fiscal capacity, but other countries simply don't. So how do you explain this to your audiences? And what is the rationale for doing it? Is it about, as the summit yesterday said, basically came to the conclusion, this is all about keeping America in, or is it about addressing the Russia threat? Is it about looking at the threat landscape for the next 5 to 10 years and what needs to be done? Is it about, you know, beefing up the independent capacity of Europe to take care and take responsibility for its own challenges? And I think, again, this is something that, you know, we haven't, I wouldn't say that we've crossed the Rubicon yet on this front, even though several steps have been taken.
Thank you. We may need a new formulation of, I guess, Lord Ismay's dictum about, you know, the purposes of NATO in terms of keeping, but or at least a reaffirmation of the keeping America in part. I am very struck by, in terms of international law, the degree to which many Europeans had alacrity to jump on board supporting the U.S. action in Iran, while at the same time the United States is being so lukewarm at best in terms of the fate of Ukraine, where that international legal point, as you pointed out, is so much clearer. Corey, I have a couple questions here for you. And just by way of background, it seems to me that the endurance of NATO has always been a function of both the common values and broadly shared threat perceptions, and both have been important. So, you know, getting a sense from you of how these are faring would be important. You know, the preamble to the Washington Treaty invokes a common attachment to democracy, the rule of law, and freedom, which I've always thought was, some people may dismiss that as window dressing, but I've always thought that it was important, and it's an embodiment and a reflection of why, it helps explain why intra-alliance relations and even dispute resolution amongst members of the alliance have always been handled without coercion or threats of abandonment, et cetera. At the same time, obviously, a common threat perception was central to NATO's founding. Otherwise, it would not have occurred. And that seemed to have been revived by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I guess I would love to know your assessment, both of the shifting sort of value foundations and the strategic foundations of NATO in the context of Trump. We heard already that that with respect to Article 5, collective defense provisions, the president was quite ambiguous en route to The Hague. So I'd be interested in getting your sense on the common threat perceptions. Is there a significant, is there enough of a significance there for this, to give us confidence in the future of the NATO alliance? And if you want to address the values question too, that would be interesting.
Sure. So I'll deal with the threat perception question first. That I absolutely think there's enough of a common threat perception. And that common threat perception is Europeans do not feel they can protect themselves without American involvement. And that's why right now, the threat everybody's responding to is American abandonment, because the world feels very dangerous given the behavior of Russia, given the behavior of China, given the behavior of Hungary, given the behavior of Turkey, given the behavior of Israel and Iran. And what makes the NATO alliance so profound and enduring is that things change over time, but this collective of countries commits to each other, trying through it together. NATO is genius. The threat perception hasn't always been common. I think in recent years, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, countries in the south of Europe in particular were much more worried about immigration, about the security of the waters of the south. The northern countries were much more worried about incursions into the Arctic. NATO's genius is managing to keep all of those plates spinning on sticks at the same time. The classic NATO formulation is the Harmel Report of 1967, right? Or the NATO dual track decision. We're going to deploy intermediate range nuclear weapons while we think they're a danger, and we're going to negotiate an elimination of them. So they get deployed because we're actually scared about the Russian deployments. And what we really want is not to have that threat to deal with. And so we come up with a magical formula of internally contradictory objectives. And that's how NATO has traditionally managed to keep all of us pulling along more or less in the same direction. I think it's easy to mythologize that there was a time when NATO was comfortably convergent, where the United States was comfortably Atlanticist and a reliable partner. And I keep looking for that period of time, and I still can't find it. But what NATO does, even in times where our values feel divergent, I mean, the Greek military coup, Turkey's slide toward authoritarianism, a time when people were very concerned about the direction of democracy in Poland, and now with concerns about the United States. NATO buys time for us to solve these problems. And I mean, I honestly, if I had been Mark Rutte 2 months ago, I would have faked a heart attack to delay the NATO summit, because I thought what President Trump was going to do was show up and repudiate Article 5 and announce the complete withdrawal of American troops from Europe. And what NATO reminded me of in the last 2 months was the genius of an institution that understands that Europe does not feel at this moment it can be secure without American help. So they are going to throw effort at the problem as how do we prevent Trump from doing those things? A flashy number 5, right? Because there's no policy input into the magic number, either in the Trump administration or at NATO, but it's big enough to keep the American president looking at the glittering number. And everybody knows that a 10-year time frame is way too long to be making those kinds of plans. The world can change dramatically, and Trump's not going to have any policy follow through anyway. So they bought themselves a solution to the problem. Mark Rutte ought to ask to be graded like Olympic diving, right? A degree of difficulty factored into his score, because to be able to pull this off, given the degree of uncertainty that the Trump administration's erratic behavior is injecting into the transatlantic relationship, is nothing short of brilliant in my judgment.
Well said, Corey. That's great. A great image. It also just reminds me of the history. I think it's a great reminder that that people often romanticize and get overly nostalgic about golden ages, but as you point out, these debates and these tensions and moments of doubt with respect to the alliance have been there since the beginning. So thank you so much, Sofiya. Obviously, Trump's return has increased this pressure for European countries to invest more in defense capabilities, but it also, I imagine, has given some greater momentum towards the argument of enhancing capabilities for strategic autonomy and to increase freedom of maneuver vis-a-vis the United States, and perhaps even there's some quiet hedging on the, depending on, or not so quiet hedging on the future intentions of the United States. So looking at major European countries, both individually and collectively, what are the opportunities and constraints that you see for European members of the alliance moving in this direction?
Yeah, really interesting question. And first of all, I mean, I was nodding along with so much that Corey was saying, and my heart just beats faster every time we get to talk about the Harmel report and any panel. So that made me very, very happy. Just briefly commenting on what has been said so far, I do think, I mean, NATO, for the next 4 years, at the very least, we're entering an era of low expectations. Okay, so that's the baseline for these summits, and I think in that context, this summit was a success, right? I mean, Mark Rutte has sacrificed a lot, including some of his public dignity. Though I would say that I mean, it's been a pet peeve of mine for ages, people talking about the transatlantic relationship in these parental patriarchal terms, you know, the teenager that you need to kick out of the basement and you reap what you sow. At some point, somebody is going to call someone daddy if you keep talking about the transatlantic relationship in these terms. But so, yes, I think the 5-for-5 deal worked well. It did what it was supposed to do. We had a slightly ambiguous commitment to Article 5 from President Trump, but I think probably ambiguous enough for Vladimir Putin. The 3.5% really matter. That's a real target. That is a serious target that is derived from NATO's regional defense plans developed under the Biden administration to deter and defend against Russia. The caveat here is that these plans assume a certain level of U.S. involvement, and we don't know yet where U.S. force posture restructuring is going to land, and NATO's plans are only as valid as the force planning that they rely on. But the 3.5% and let's be honest, particularly the commitment of the big economic powerhouse in Germany and Europe, Germany, to commit to that 3.5% and actually giving itself the fiscal space to follow up on that commitment by 2029. That is huge news. That is going to really restructure the European rearmament effort. That is so much money that Germany is going to be the third largest global defense spender by 2029 compared to where China and the United States and Russia are right now. So it's important that, you know, for unity's sake and symbolically and for national resilience, that everybody commits to that goal. But you know, the smaller states won't have as much of an impact as the big countries will, and that Germany has committed is a really, really big success. You know, I also agree with Corey that the real threat assessment is about the dependency on the United States and Europe right now. We've had two shocks. We've had the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and we've had the second election of President Donald Trump, and we have the 3.5% commitment now, right? So there, something really changed in the minds of even the more transatlantically minded leaders like Friedrich Merz or Donald Tusk, who are now speaking openly about the need for greater independence from the US. I don't think we're calling it strategic autonomy anymore, but we are now sort of quietly working towards it, which to me is the preferred outcome. I've already talked about the key test, I think, is to follow the money. The constraints are significant. Europe's defense architecture was never designed for self-reliance. European militaries were built to slot into US-led coalitions in recent decades, not to operate autonomously. And the capability gaps in ISR, strategic lift missile defense, they're not operational extras. They're the backbone of modern warfare, and Europe doesn't currently have them at scale. We're working towards it. I can paint you a fairly optimistic picture about how we could get there, but this summit that we just saw was an expression of the realization that we're not currently there. I'll just make one final point, which is that a real struggle for Europeans continues to be the ambiguity in the US messaging, which isn't entirely consistent, right? We have conservative, restrained-minded policymakers in Washington that welcome European strategic autonomy. We have other voices in the Trump administration that are openly hostile to it still, particularly when it comes to defense industrial autonomy. There's some who are prepared to scale back US troop commitments, some who still want to hold on to American leverage over European procurement and technology. You know, I think right now, Peter Rao, our colleague, has framed this really usefully in the sense of, is this administration able to capitalize, operationalize the sense of anxiety that it has created? And some clearer messaging, I think, would be helpful. That said, it's Europe's responsibility. It's not the United States' responsibility to give us a clear message. I think partly the fact that we don't have it right now should be read by Europeans as a sign of the fact that Europe has just dropped down as an agenda item in terms of importance. There's no great strategic vision for how we want to get Europe there. And so this goes to the argument that the challenge isn't just budgetary, it's organizational, it's political, right? The US has long played this role of the disciplinarian, the coordinator, the unifier for European defense. And with that anchor now at least uncertain, the real question is who leads, how are we organizing this effort? And there is no single European state that is capable of filling that vacuum, I think. And so this goes beyond the United States. Strategic autonomy requires strategy. It requires agreement on what Europe is defending and why. And we are really seeing these conversations happening, bubbling beneath the surface, and then sometimes getting into the headlines with debates over whether to call the EU rearmament package a rearmament package or a readiness package, with debates over how Spain and Italy don't really feel represented by the organizational principle being Ukraine's security and defending and deterring against Russia inside NATO. And as terminology isn't going to resolve this, money isn't going to resolve this, but Europe needs to define a common defense interest that justifies long-term investment, risk sharing, solidarity. And I think that is the debate that can and must happen without the United States right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sofiya. It's always been interesting to me, this sort of tension within U.S. Positions with respect to European defense capabilities, of course, which is that, yes, please develop your capabilities and only use them under NATO. This has always been a little bit of an issue.
Which, by the way, we're happy to use them under NATO. NATO is the most cost-efficient, easiest way to use them. The question is, where are we buying them from, and can we rely on the US as we use them? But yeah.
Got you. Yeah, and by the way, we have put into along the screen, inviting people to put in questions if they have any. Those folks online, they can put them in the chat, and if we get any, we will try to address a couple of them, one or two of them, before we end in about 15 minutes. I did want to talk a little bit more, and perhaps ask you, Corey, at least for starters, about the broader implications for global order of the Trump revolution. And you've made a very strong case that the West, of course, should continue to exist, and in a sense as a coherent geopolitical entity. But at the same time, if some U.S. commitments under the America First program are becoming less obvious, or less strong, and the United States does not have the same sort of global presence that it had before, I'm just wondering, do you worry about who fills that vacuum? Are you confident that it could be, for instance, democratic powers that continue to uphold the order as we've known it? Do you anticipate China and others taking advantage of what could be, if not a disintegration, then an erosion of the West's collective capability, and not least the United States, and willingness, I should say, to actually serve as a guarantor of global order?
I absolutely worry about it, right? Like, if the West isn't setting and enforcing international order, first of all, there will be more disorder, right? I think that we are already seeing. We are all paying a chaos premium in the Trump administration. Random tariff standards on everybody in the world simultaneously. The president not only isn't playing four-dimensional chess, he's playing one-dimensional checkers, right? Like, the administration seems to think we are the only organization or country with agency, and we make a move and then dictate that it's over. And that tends not to be how these things work. So the chaos premium, I think we're all already paying. But I share your worry, Stuart, that where we are headed is that American unreliability will create so many opportunities for others to assert rules that they have the power to enforce, absent collective effort by the West. And not just Europe, but the United States is not going to like those rules, right? I mean, our half-heartedness in support of Ukraine has already created the perception that countries strong enough to create a sphere of influence by destabilizing surrounding countries is going to be successful. And we are not going to like in Asia, where China assertively adopts that. We're not going to like the continent of Africa if that takes hold. So I think the Trump administration, in addition to the chaos premium, creates two additional things to worry about in terms of international order. And one is creating opportunities for other rule setters that are going to impose rules much less beneficial to the safety and prosperity of the West. But also, I think we run the risk of the US as a rogue superpower, that the sources of American dynamism domestically and the inadequacies of other powers to be able to do what the United States does well could create unilateral advantages that I think Trump already imagines, right, in how he wants to have bilateral negotiations and an end to multilateralism, that you could see a United States that behaves much more like a traditional great power than how the United States has behaved since 1945.
Your article, thank you, Corey. Your article has a great line that says that the United States has moved from indispensable to insufferable. I really do. I really do recommend that everybody looks at it. We do have an audience question, which I'd like to throw out. And perhaps I'll ask Rosa this for starters. If Europe wants to be strategically autonomous, will the USA let it, lest it lose its strategic hegemony and cultivate another potential peer rival? Are those is that a question that is live in Brussels?
I'm sorry, you're asking Rosa?
Yeah, I was going to ask. Yeah, I was going to ask Rosa, and then I'll turn to you, Corey.
Yeah, I mean, I think the US piece, I'd be interested to hear what Corey has to say. Will the US actually let that happen? And to be honest, that's what a lot of Europeans say, is that, you know, the US wants us to spend more on defense, but then when we try to beef up our capabilities by investing in, you know, creating a European defense industry, then the US comes in and says, no, hang on a minute, you need to buy from us. And that is a little bit one of the arguments behind the fact that Europeans haven't actually invested much on strengthening their defense capacity. And this will continue to be there. And in fact, there is, you know, there still are, with all this fresh financing into European defense that is coming from Germany, from other countries, from the NATO targets, but also from European institutions, they're trying to facilitate that, how that those resources will be spent. You know, there are many who are arguing we really need to use this to build up a European defense industry. So I'd like to hear from, you know, Corey, what you know, would you know, is it, you know, be careful what you wish for those Americans who've been saying that Europeans need to spend more? Well, what if then Europe becomes more, you know, autonomous from the US? It's not really happening yet. I mean, I'm just looking through the discussions that are taking place at this summit here in Brussels. And for instance, on the Middle East, there was a report earlier this week that was discussed among the foreign ministers as to whether Europeans believe that Israel has violated human rights in Gaza, and whether Europeans should take this into account and you know, use the trade agreements with Israel to punish Israel for this. And they actually haven't made a decision, right? They're postponing it to July. So it seems to me that Europeans are actually being very, very cautious in making decisions that might upset the United States. So that would be my initial comment. But I think Corey perhaps can speak more from the US side.
So if Europe wants to be strategically autonomous, the Trump administration will say, great, do it, we're out of here. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think there are two reasons. There's both a narrow Trump reason and a broader American order reason that would be the case. First, the Trump team doesn't actually believe allies strengthen American power, right? That's fundamental in how they think about it. They think America's involvement in Europe is a distraction from our real priorities. And they genuinely don't understand that you can't deploy an armored division to the Middle East without the ports of Antwerp and Hamburg. You can't save American soldiers' lives in Afghanistan without the hospital at Landstuhl in Germany. You can't get American military forces anyplace without preferential access to the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, right? Like, they just don't understand. And if strategic autonomy progresses, the United States is going to get a very rough education about what the world looks like when allies don't give us overflight, when allies don't rely on American weapons, so we have less interoperability of our own forces. The second reason I think that the US will let it is because the US actually doesn't, how are we going to force them not to, right? The American order that was built by the US and its allies after 1945 is a fundamentally consensual order. When France, in objection to American nuclear strategy in 1967, withdrew from the NATO Integrated Military Command and threw American forces out of France, Lyndon Johnson's answer was, when a man tells you to get out of his house, you take your hat and leave. And that will be the answer this time too.
Let me go probably for our final intervention from to Sofiya, and two quick points. One, although complicated in her big answers, big questions. Do you believe that Trump's commitment on Article 5 will quiet European worries? And then the second one is a bit broader, is as America retrenches, are European countries either are European countries looking at non-Western powers and new relationships, geopolitical relationships with non-Western powers, emerging powers, probably democratic, but not necessarily so, to, in a sense, hedge their bets in terms of building up a coalition that actually can support international order? Big questions.
Very big questions, and I have about 2 minutes left. So first, just really briefly on will the US let it? We're not in that situation at all right now. The reason that Europeans have questions, I think, with this administration is that somebody like Secretary Rubio very actively lobbies against what is perceived in Europe as the defense industrial side of strategic autonomy, very actively lobbies for continued US participation in European arms markets, and wants, frankly, Europeans to continue buying American kit, which they are happy to do because the American kit is of very high quality and it's important for interoperability, but it also used to be attached to implicit security guarantees. And that part of the bargain, I think, is what Europeans are questioning right now. Which brings me to the sort of Article 5 commitment, and I'm using air quotes here. It was a very ambiguous commitment, even at this recent NATO summit. There are always two audiences here, right? There's the audience of your allies and there's the audience of your adversaries. And it's much harder to reassure your allies than it is to deter your adversaries. And I think Europeans, or I at least, think that the commitment at the summit was ambiguous enough to maybe make Putin pause. But it's never going to be enough to quiet European worries. It's never been enough. Neither conventional nor nuclear deterrence. There's not enough the US could say or do to quiet European worries, which is why I think that independent from whoever is the United States president, Europeans need to be able to defend themselves and work with the US when they can and when it's possible, but they need to have a certain level of independence and autonomy there. And then finally, on the hedging question, I think the idea that there's going to be counterbalancing hedging towards China, really, in European countries is predicated on the notion that the extent of the European policy shift on China, seeing the country more as a rival and less as a partner, was really dictated only by the United States. And I don't think that's true. I think it was certainly shepherded along by the United States, but that overlooks the fact that many European countries have formed their own risk analysis of China right now. And so I don't think that all of that falls away just because the United States becomes a more complicated partner. The answer of where they're going to land with China is nuanced from country to country, depends on the economic ties, depends on the dependencies with China. But I don't think that it is just the Trump factor, if you will, that is going to determine that.
Thank you so much. That's a very economical answer to a very big question. So thank you so much, Sofiya. You mentioned two audiences, adversaries and allies. There's obviously another audience, which is domestic in all of these countries. And hopefully we've contributed at least to some of the debate about how to think of these things in the broader foreign policy community. I want to thank you all, Sofiya, Corey, Rosa. Can we do this every day? Anyway, I really, really enjoyed it. And I always learned so much from each of you. So thank you so much until you join us next time. So that concludes our program.